is the Banner Ravens podcast. Paul Mancano joined by Jonas, Shaffer, and Giana Han from the NFL Scouting Combine in Indianapolis. We are going to talk about what we heard from Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh on the first day of media availability down at the Combine. They talked about the Justin Tucker allegations. They talked about Ronnie Stanley's free agency, Mark Andrews, and much, much more. We're going to dive into it all. But first, let's get a quick word.
Don't miss the 2025 CIAA Men's and Women's Basketball Tournament in Baltimore, February 25th to March 1st at CFG Bank Arena. Watch HBCU teams battle to be crowned champion. Check out the free fan fest and performances at the Baltimore Convention Center. Enjoy downtown's top restaurants and stay in one of our amazing hotels. The CIAA Men's and Women's Basketball Tournament. You want to be here.
All right, thanks for joining us here on the Banner Ravens podcast. First off, write us a quick review. Give us a thumbs up anywhere that you are listening or watching. I will read out a 5-star review if you write us one on Apple Podcasts. Our word of the day today is combine. The definition, a combination of persons or groups for the furtherance of their political, commercial, or other interests as a syndicate, cartel, or trust. First known usage, 1375 to 1425. We are talking about the NFL Scouting Combine, and that's why our Who's Got It Better Than award today goes to Giana Han, beat writer for the Baltimore Banner, who is joining us from Indianapolis. Giana, thanks so much for taking time out of what I'm sure is a schedule full of finding new coffee shops, as Jonas said in our last podcast. How much have you found any new coffee shops? Are you exploring the area? I'm sure you're overly familiar with Indy at this point.
Yeah, so when I travel, I normally like to find a bunch of coffee shops, usually some unique ones. I have nothing against Starbucks as a former Starbucks employee, but, like to support small businesses. However, here it is the debate between which Starbucks. So, we have the convention center, which is where we're doing all of our interviews, and it connects to all these different hotels. So like the Hyatt, the Marriott, the Westin, the JW, and as most Marriotts do, they have Starbucks. So, we had a little conversation in our Girl Reporter group chat about which one you should go to and when, at what times, what type of people you see at each of them. They're great, just like places to run into people. So it has been pretty much Starbucks. The best coffee spot to me, though, is the JW Marriott Lounge because it's free. So we love free things.
That's the best place to do it. I've never been to the Scouting Combine, but I have been to the baseball winter meetings, and it's the exact same thing. It's like you find 3 Starbucks, and you're guaranteed to run into a GM or manager at any one of those Starbucks. But you do learn a lot about people from their order. All right, we are going to talk about what we've heard from John Harbaugh, from Eric DeCosta down at the Combine, because they spoke with the media yesterday on Tuesday. We got to start with Justin Tucker, because this is the first time that Eric DeCosta has spoken with the media since the Baltimore Banner's investigation into kicker Justin Tucker. Now, the initial report came out back at the end of January, on January 30th, that 6 massage therapists from 4 high-end spas and wellness centers in the Baltimore area accused Tucker of inappropriate sexual behavior. That number is now up to 16 massage therapists at 8 different spas, and 2 of the spas say Tucker's behavior was so egregious that they banned him from returning. You can read all of our coverage on the BaltimoreBanner.com as we have complete coverage of this. Now, Justin Tucker has denied all wrongdoing, and the Ravens had not commented on these allegations since the Banner's initial report, and they released a statement at that point, and a spokesperson said they were aware of the story and that the quote we take any allegations of this nature seriously and will continue to monitor the situation. So that's all the background on the Justin Tucker situation. This is the first time that media members actually got to ask DeCosta and Harbaugh questions about this. And the first question about this topic came from our own Kyle Goon, and it was whether Justin Tucker could be subject to termination based on the team's zero tolerance policy. And here's what Eric DeCosta
I think a lot goes into that. First of all, good question. Appreciate the question. The allegations are serious, concerning. The amount of allegations are serious and concerning. I think we're fortunate that the league is doing an investigation. We'll wait as patiently as we can for as much information as we can, and we'll make our decisions based on that.
Just the volume of the allegations. How does that play into your deliberations on that?
Well, I think, again, it's a good question. I think the biggest thing that we have to do, first of all, is look at every single case differently. There are no absolutes. And I think in this case, we're still awaiting as much information as possible. Again, we're fortunate that the league it's come down to Baltimore. I met with the league. I believe the league is meeting with other people in Baltimore as well. We'll wait for the details of that investigation, and we'll make a decision based on that.
Okay, so obviously the first thing that stands out there is Eric DeCosta calling these allegations concerning, and calling the volume of allegations concerning and serious. So, Gianna, I want to get your first reaction to what Eric DeCosta had to say. What was your reaction, and Kyle Goon's reaction as well, as you guys were both there in person in Indianapolis, to what Eric DeCosta had to say about these allegations?
I think the serious part of it was pretty expected. I think that's what they're going to always say. If I remember correctly, that's probably how they addressed the questions that we had to ask last year about the investigation into Zay Flowers. And, teams want you to know that they're taking things seriously. So that part was expected. It was the concerning part, the fact that he, in journalism, we'd say editorialized a little bit, shared a little bit of an opinion about it, was a little bit surprising. And then I really appreciated that in that first answer, he talked about the NFL investigation. I think everyone's been calling for some sort of reaction, some sort of statement from the Ravens since the very first one, that they just said that they were aware and they're monitoring. If you read Jonas's story from the other day, I thought that gave some good perspective of, the team there is kind of limited in what they can say when there is this investigation going. And so I thought it was important that he noted the NFL is investigating. We are going along with what the NFL is doing. They're the ones taking charge here, as they are their governing body. That makes sense. So I thought that was really nice context to have. And I did think it was a little bit interesting. It would be cool or not cool, interesting to hear what you guys think about the fact that he said, we'll wait for as long as possible, as long as we can. I'm not quite sure what that means. Maybe it just means if it takes too long and they have to make roster decisions. But yeah, there was kind of a lot to unpack in that first response, which I wasn't sure, since there had been so much silence ahead of time. We just didn't know how they would respond. We didn't know if they would try to shut it down pretty quickly. But he said, great question. He answered it in a lot of different aspects. And from there, as we'll get into, talked a little bit more about it.
Yeah, Jonas, speaking of the timeline, because he did say, Eric DeCosta said, we will be as patient as we can in terms of how they react to this. In terms of the timeline, I mean, you've written about on the BaltimoreBanner.com, and we've talked about before how NFL investigations, they're not exactly transparent in terms of how far along investigations are and how quickly they take. So how long could something like this go? Do we have any grasp for it?
I mean, there have been lower volume investigations that hit on the same subjects of either sexual assault or domestic violence or allegations of misbehavior that have taken months to conclude, longer than half a year. The Deshaun Watson situation obviously took, I think, over a year to be resolved. And the Ravens don't really have that kind of timeline if they are going to play the kind of hardball that they want to when the new league year opens. So it seems a little bit unrealistic that this thing will be completed by March 12th. Obviously we got sources last week telling us that the investigation was starting, that NFL investigators were in Baltimore to talk to some of the massage therapists who have accused Justin Tucker of misbehavior. So maybe there is this swift, conclusion that there is this swift resolution, but it seems like that would be unlikely. And I don't know how the Ravens waiting for all of the details of the investigation, if that is indeed their intention in this, would lead them to make a decision, by mid-March or by the end of March or, even mid-April. I mean, this is a weighty thing to get through. We don't know if other women will come forward. We don't know what other situations might arise that could complicate this. And force the Ravens or force NFL investigators to go back to the drawing board. So it's going to be really interesting to see just one, how much information the NFL is willing to share with the Ravens. Do they give them kind of drips and drabs as the process goes on, or is it a situation where it is just a black box until they actually get to the end of their investigation? Because that could probably, guide the Ravens' hand in a lot of ways and determine what their next step is with Justin Tucker.
And we have talked about how the Ravens, if they were to cut Justin Tucker, it would behoove them to wait until the June 1 deadline. Now they could designate a player with a post June 1 designation, which means that at the start of the league year, they can essentially say, we're waiting until June 1st to release him. It's similar to what they did with OBJ last year in order to save that salary cap space. And they could also say, like we've said before, that like the Jets did with Aaron Rodgers, they could release a statement. They could make some public proclamation that they are moving on from Justin Tucker. They don't have to wait until the roster move is actually completed before they actually make an announcement in that way. Now, obviously, them waiting for the conclusion of the NFL investigation, if that is what they intend to do, could make it difficult to build a roster if we still don't know the status of Justin Tucker, if he is going to be on this roster in 2025 or not, because the league year starts in just a couple weeks. Free agency opens in just a couple weeks. That is when all these guys hit free agency. They're eligible to sign contracts. And so that's why there is kind of this artificial timeline on when the Ravens, it would make sense for them to have their mind made up or have an idea of what is going to happen with Justin Tucker, because from a roster standpoint, it helps to get as much clarification on this stuff as early as possible. So John Harbaugh also spoke with the media yesterday, and he answered questions about the Justin Tucker allegations and situations. And the first question posed to John Harbaugh was, what was his first reaction to the news that these women were making allegations against Justin Tucker? Here's what he had to say.
Oh, absolutely. It's not what you want to wake up and read. You don't want to read about it. It's not something you want to see. I don't care what it is in terms of, things that are hurtful and harmful to people. There's too many headlines like that, too many stories that you hear that just make you just sad, disappointed. And you don't want to ever see a circumstance, a situation, especially as it relates to, your world where, anybody's made to feel less than great when they come and are involved in a work experience somewhere, and as it touches all of us in our lives, we want to do everything we can to make sure that this is just the opposite, that everybody feels like they have a great work experience. You guys have been at our place every day, and you know what we try to do with that. So that's just really a tough deal, and the NFL is looking into it. They're going to come up, they're going to review it, they're going to try to gather all the facts, and hopefully I'm sure we'll have an understanding of it at that time. And then once there's an understanding of it, then you have a chance to, make some decisions and determinations and things like that, and that's where we're at right now. Yeah, and that's what we're waiting to try to do, is reconcile it. That's what the process is for. That's why you've got to come to an understanding, if you can, about what happened. We've all got questions, but nobody knows exactly what happened. So let's see where the review takes us. Yeah. I learned after Eric told me, I think right before it came out, maybe the banner had called Eric and told him that there was something coming out. We didn't know anything about what it was going to be, so I knew what it was when I read it. And then, I don't know, a week and a half, 2 weeks after that, I gave Justin a call on a Sunday morning, and we had a conversation about it and talked about it. More about, just more from a perspective of being together for all these years, kind of what he was going through and, what he was dealing with that, and kind of how he's handling with his family and things like that. And that was really what we talked about. Really, it's not so much about like what level national or what level of attention something gets. It's the fact that it's so important to somebody in our program. I mean, to me, it's like people walk in the door in this job, you've kind of, God appointment, sometimes we call it, but things come up all the time. You could be dug deep in the middle of some football-related task, and someone walks in your door with something that's number one important to them, and they're talking to, the boss, so to speak, or the head coach or whatever, and they need your time and they need your attention. So to me, it's exactly the same as any one of those conversations that you'd have. Every position is important. We're going to look at every single position, but certainly different years you look at different positions. We're looking at kickers. I mean, we're looking at a lot of positions. We're looking at every position, but I'd say the kicker position would have been a priority no matter what, because Justin's our kicker. We love him, and I expect him. Would have always expected him to keep keep going forever, but nobody goes forever. So we've got to look at every position like we do.
All right, so you heard there John Harbaugh talk about how this team is looking at kickers. That's kind of slightly different from what we heard from them at their end of season press conference, where they indicated that they had faith in Justin Tucker's ability to kick the football. I mean, the second half of the season after the bye, he didn't miss a kick, played very well. But now John Harbaugh is indicating, well, nobody plays forever. You know, we know Justin Tucker is 35, so we know that he is closer to the end of his career than he is the beginning of his career. But in terms of how all this plays out, you know, free agency negotiating period begins March 10th. The draft is at the end of April, and the Ravens are at the combine now, getting a close look at a lot of draft prospects. And I thought it was interesting that he specifically said, we are looking at kickers. And even if this report did not come out, the investigation did not come out, he indicated they would be looking at kickers regardless. Gianna, what was your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of coach speak in there, right? When he talks about we're looking at every position. We always look at every position, but the fact that he was in like, and I would say this is the position that we're looking at shows that it is something that they're evaluating. That now there are only 4 kickers at the combine, but there are more in the draft. I believe I heard either before all the other guys tested or today, which is still before some guys are testing, they actually have a specialist like combine where they bring in even more kickers and specialists. It's not open to us, but I would assume the Ravens are there scouting. And I do think, you know, he struggled this year. They claim they have faith in him to, you know, figure it out, but we've really had such a small sample size that there is no proof he figured it out. On top of that, there's a lot of theories about what he was struggling with, but people were saying like his stance, just a specific way he does things is more subject to age. And he's 35. Like, yes, some kickers go into their 40s to the free agents right now are 40, but it would be smart of them to at least start looking at kickers. So it wasn't like a surprising response. It definitely is notable though, because they probably have an eye on kickers because they always do. They always keep an eye on it. That's something he said during the year. As people are talking about bringing in competition for Tucker, is that they always have an eye on it. But to explicitly say like, yeah, that's something this year we're going to be looking at, I do think is notable.
Yeah, I mean, they've always kind of they've had the tendency to bring in a camp leg, quote unquote, but the idea that they are now potentially looking at a replacement for Justin Tucker is definitely notable. Jonas, what did you make of that? And what do you think the Ravens' options were to be if they are in fact moving on from Justin Tucker?
I chuckled when he said you have a chance to make some determinations, because there was a very, very soft D in that last word where, to me, even hearing it back now a second or third time, it sounded like you have a chance to make some terminations, which a little bit of a Freudian slip there, perhaps. I think this is probably about what we expected from Harbaugh. You know, he spoke with empathy. Obviously, the clip that you didn't include there, Paul, was him saying that, you know, he loves Justin Tucker, which is probably a little bit of a reflexive saying for him. Don't know if he would want that one back if he would get the chance, considering everything that has been levied against Justin Tucker in the past month or so. But, you know, I think we probably all see the writing on the wall that regardless of when the Ravens make their decision on Justin Tucker, it's probably last call for him in Baltimore. So they're going to have to find someone. They're going to have to decide what exactly the succession plan is. They're going to have to, you know, rely on Randy Brown and his expertise and his sources to figure out which of these guys are ready to kick at an NFL level with NFL level scrutiny. I mean, I don't know if there will be a guy with maybe more outsized pressure on him than the guy stepping in for Justin Tucker, not only because of how big those shoes are to fill, but also just because of how big some of the games that we expect the Ravens to play in next year and how close we expect those games to be will be. So good luck to the guy who replaces Justin Tucker, whether it's this year, next year, 5 years from now. But it seems like based on how open the Ravens are and talking about the possibility for a succession plan, that the wheels are already in motion to to enact that
Yeah, and
plan.
obviously Justin Tucker himself was an undrafted free agent, and that was an incredible find as a player when the Ravens got him back in 2012. But that doesn't always happen. That it's not always that you find a potential Hall of Fame level kicker in undrafted free agency just because it is a devalued position. All right,
And
so we mentioned at the
I'll
beginning. Oh, go ahead, Gianna.
I'll add real quick that another challenge to all this is that kickers are really hard to scout because if you look at, well, Justin Tucker again was undrafted and his accuracy was built up over years. Like he didn't have all these crazy numbers. It took him a while to be the most accurate for a season. It was just overall he had a really high career field goal percentage. And so when you're looking at these college kickers, they have 4 years, maybe less, maybe more because of COVID. And one of the things that I was talking to some people about here who are way more knowledgeable than me about specialists is that a lot of it is their form and this and that, but that can be taught. It's them really trying to test who they are as a person and just like how they respond to different situations, because as Jonas said, especially for one coming in the Ravens, they're going to be stepping into really big shoes and they're going to be in these big games. And so that's apparently what they're looking for. And that's something that you really need to start figuring out. Like, even if you're not drafting them now, just down the line, you need to know these guys' like mentalities. And that's about as much as you can do because you have such a limited sample size of just them kicking.
Yeah, and the Ravens have had the luxury of not having to think about this position at all the last decade and a half. They haven't had to worry about it because it has not been a question on their roster. Now they're having to dive back into it. All right, so we mentioned at the top of the podcast the zero tolerance policy. Kyle Goon referenced it in his first question to Eric DeCosta. So some background on that. So back in 2022, Deshaun Watson was sued by more than 24 women of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And John Harbaugh was asked by members of the Baltimore media about that and what their policy would be in regards to if a player on their roster or somebody that they were looking to acquire had similar allegations. And he said, quote, "What we decided was that we're kind of zero tolerance. We've stayed away from that particular situation. I'm glad we have that policy," end quote. So the question was posed to Eric DeCosta at the Combine if he could outline the Ravens' zero tolerance policy that was mentioned by Harbaugh 3 years ago. And here's what Eric DeCosta had to say.
I really can't because, again, we look at every case differently. And the facts in every single case, we do this for a living. We study players. We look at background. We consider all these different things. Every case is entirely different facts, different situations. So we'll wait for the investigation to take place, and we'll make a decision based off of that.
What were you aware that potentially there were allegations? When was the first time you were aware of these allegations?
Right, so we were aware that a local media outlet was getting prepared to do a story on Justin Tucker, and that was the first time that we became aware of those allegations or the potential allegations that might result. Right, so I think, I've answered about 4 questions on this situation. I did meet with Justin. I'm going to keep those comments to myself. And personal conversations with Justin, I think, is probably the smart thing to do. But at that point, we did, meet, and that's what I'm going to say about that.
Okay, so to be clear, the only reason Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh were asked about a zero tolerance policy is because this was specifically said publicly by John Harbaugh, was that they had, quote, a kind of zero tolerance policy. But Gianna, you were there in Indianapolis, and that wasn't quite the end of that discussion because shortly after these press conferences, a spokesperson for the Ravens issued a statement to the Baltimore media, quote, "The Ravens do not have a defined written zero tolerance policy. Each situation stands on its own. Actions will be determined after the facts are known," end quote. How did that transpire? How take us through what exactly happened and how that statement was issued to you?
Yeah, so just for some background context, Tuesday and Wednesday, coaches and GMs take turns at these podiums. You have this little list and different people go around, everyone can ask questions. But for a lot of coaches and GMs, we can see on the side that they will do off the records or some such conversation, sometimes on the record just for the local beat, but they'll do something off podium before or after they speak. So, for example, Mike McDonald spoke after today, and the Eagles spoke before. And we asked and were told explicitly there was going to be no such conversation. So we went in asking about the zero tolerance policy because, that's one of the most buzzy things that they've said on this topic, right? And even I was talking to different people who covered the Deshaun Watson case. They all immediately pointed out, John Harbaugh said that they have a zero tolerance policy. So this is very, people are asking about it, not just us.
Sure.
And so we get through all of this, and Kyle has his column written already about something that was not what ended up being published, because then we get asked for all the beat members, so all the people who are regularly covering the team, to step outside and speak to this team spokesperson who explains that there never was a written zero tolerance policy, which, as to kind of sum up what Kyle was saying in his column, that makes sense. Like, it makes sense that there's not a zero tolerance policy, because zero, for my math nerds, is an absolute number, right? That would mean even allegations, whispers of things. So say Flowers, nothing was proven, but even the whispers would mean nothing. So it does make sense to do what they said, which is they find out all the facts, come to an understanding. They love to say that, and then determine their actions. That all makes sense. The problem was the zero tolerance policy thing is out there. It's been out there. So we had to workshop out there among the beat and team personnel what exactly to say. And I believe, I don't know if you have written, I can find it, the exact wording that they gave us, which is, according to the team, the Ravens do not have a defined written zero tolerance policy. Each situation stands on its own. Actions will be determined after the facts are known. So that's kind of how it all came about. It was after everything had gone down, after we asked all the questions, after all the quotes are out there. As they pointed out, my video of Eric DeCosta not being able to explain it is out there. So it wasn't till afterwards that we found out that they don't actually have a zero tolerance policy. Even though John Harbaugh did double down on it when he was asked the very last question, do you regret saying that you guys have a zero tolerance policy? And he goes, absolutely not. So yeah, it was just not how we expected the line of questioning and reporting to go that day.
Yeah. Jonas, what's your take on this? You have the floor.
I'm thinking about a lot of different things in this. I'm thinking about like this idea of like some franchises across sports have this exceptionalism applied to them. I think that was something that was invoked a lot after the Lakers ended up with Luka Doncic, which kind of giving them a second life for the post LeBron era. And it's like, well, of course the Lakers got Luka. It's this idea of Lakers exceptionalism just kind of bearing out. And I think there's this idea of Ravens exceptionalism, and I think that has taken a knock in the past few years. You see with the NFLPA surveys, which the new came out today, they are 13th according to these player grades, and you want to take them with a grain of sand or grain of salt, because we don't know who's responding. We don't know how many of these guys just have an axe to grind, that kind of thing. But they haven't been higher than 13th, and in the 3 years that the NFLPA has held these surveys, and they're averaging about 50 responses a team, so it's not exactly a small sample size. And you think back to how the Ravens have just handled these questions about the zero tolerance policy. Like, it's fine if it's fine that they're saying now that they don't have a defined written zero tolerance policy, but to act as if there wasn't every opportunity over the past year or 2 years or 3 years, even going back to when John first made that statement, to correct and let the record show that this is actually what we do. It's not a good look, in my opinion. It's kind of goes back to the idea that, like, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. Like, why bother to clear up this idea that we are something more than we're not, when people are going to keep on believing it otherwise? So it's disappointing. It reminds me a little bit of the Aaron Rodgers situation during his whole COVID uh, drama with the Packers, where he was asked before the season, I think, if he was vaccinated, and he said he was immunized, and people took that to mean, because Aaron Rodgers is a very weird dude, that meant that he was in fact vaccinated by the standards of what the NFL was enforcing for their COVID policy. But then the season comes along, he gets sick, gets the COVID infection, whatever exactly the deal was, and he has to be sidelined for longer than usual because he had been doing his own medicine, and he had not taken the strict COVID vaccine that the other guys on the team had. And just like, this was an obvious lie by the letter of the law, and something should have been said, something should have been rectified, so that people knew where you stood, where the Ravens stood, where Aaron Rodgers stood, and there was not enough done. And it's just a shame that, like, this will probably all get glossed over, because the Ravens, to their credit, have done a good job of steering clear of players with red flags. But it's clear that for all intents and purposes, this is a team that handles its off-field incidents a lot like every other team. And I don't think we should give them the benefit of the doubt or credit for being this team that is any more serious than your standard issue NFL franchise when it comes to matters of domestic violence or sexual misconduct or whatever kind of garden variety issue tends to arise with these NFL players.
The reason that it is notable, the reason that we're having this conversation, is that there's a discrepancy between what was said and what was acted upon, and the actions that the franchise took place. And now there is a walking back and a seeming changing of a policy. And so to say that we have kind of zero tolerance 3 years ago, less than 3 years ago, and now to say the Ravens do not have a defined written zero tolerance policy is a clear discrepancy.
And I do think it's important to point out that that DeCosta, former team president DeCosta, and owner Steve Bisciotti have said that it is a case-by-case basis, very similar to what they actually said. So they do have some sort of policy. It was just that when, I guess, as Jonas said, the misrepresentation of it came about, they didn't correct it. And when we asked again last year to Sashi Brown, based on Harbaugh's comments of zero tolerance, he just said the policy hadn't changed, and now the policy was the case-by-case policy. Like, there is a policy, it's just not what we thought it was, and what they allowed us to believe it was. And we haven't heard from Steve Bisciotti on it at all either. So that also has played a little bit into the confusion about this, because ultimately it is his team. But I did want to just say they do have a policy. It's just not what we thought it was.
Yeah, well said. Kyle Goon has written a column on the BaltimoreBanner.com where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months in reaction to what was said in Indianapolis and the zero tolerance policy existence or non-existence. And Giana has written so much great stuff already from Indianapolis about what she has heard and seen. Giana, before we get you out of here, and we're going to talk, Jonas and I are going to talk in a bit about Ronnie Stanley, about free agency and all that good stuff. But what are you hearing in the halls and in the streets of Indianapolis about the Baltimore Ravens, other than the stuff that we just discussed?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the conversations have been about Tucker, especially when, because I think people know that we're from the Banner, but I think that and a lot of the conversations at the podium were also dominated by this. But I attended the Women's Forum this morning and got to see some of the Ravens personnel there, which, as Harbaugh talked about, they have several female coaches, but I think a lot of the conversations have been about the Eagles, which is understandable. They just won, but very similar to the Ravens. The Eagles found success by building up front And so a lot of teams are being asked about that. And the Ravens have always believed in that. So kind of reinforcing that belief. Former DC Mike McDonald was asked about it as well. So I think a lot of the conversation, and again, this goes to the way the situation is handled, is that a lot of the conversations when it comes to Ravens right now is just Justin Tucker. I mean, if you watch the ticker on all the screens that are up and all the hotels and everything, it's just constant, like Ravens Justin Tucker. So I've learned a lot of other stuff about other teams and things like that. But yeah, it's been pretty much the dominant conversation here.
Yeah. Well, continue to get more good inside scoops and information while you're in Indy. I know you only have to deal with Kyle for a couple more days, so good that he's coming back to Baltimore soon. Giana at Giana_Jade is her handle on everything. Giana, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Can't wait to read more of your stuff.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's the wonderful Giana Han joining us here on the Banner Ravens podcast. Jonas, just you and I now. Let's talk about what we heard from Eric DeCosta from John Harbaugh about Ronnie Stanley, because that is another big dominant topic here. When asked about Ronnie Stanley in particular, seemed both general manager and head coach seemed pretty optimistic about the Ravens' ability to retain their franchise left tackle. Quote, Eric DeCosta, to quote him directly, said, "You never want to say 100%, but I feel good that we'll have good, healthy debate," end quote. He said he was also meeting with Ronnie Stanley's agent this week in Indianapolis and that he was optimistic they would get a deal done. John Harbaugh said he thought Ronnie would probably come back to the Ravens. Seems sure like, the Ravens could be, obviously paying lip service to Ronnie Stanley, one of their more longer tenured player and franchise left tackle. But I feel like they wouldn't be this vocally optimistic if they didn't feel like something was possible here.
Yeah, I think for the most part, what you see is what you get from Eric and from John. So, when John says he feels pretty good about someone playing, that someone is probably going to play. And I think it was notable that he was as optimistic, if you read between the lines, as Eric was about getting Ronnie back. And I kind of go back to what Eric said before the start of 2024 season, where he did his preseason media availability, was asked about a bunch of subjects, but one of them was that offensive line. And he was talking about the guys up front, and he said, "We may have a couple of hiccups along the way, but I think we've started to build from the bottom up, and I think a year from now we'll be in a great place." And listen, I understand there's a lot of sensitivity about whether this line was actually good. I think it was good. I don't think it was great. I think there are a lot of people online who believe it was a bad line. I think I would encourage you to look at line play around the league before you make that kind of determination. But I think it would be out of character, and it would definitely be not aligned with this optimism for 2025 if the Ravens kind of throw up their hands and say, we're not going to do what we can to retain what was one of the better parts of this offensive line. Like, I think there are obviously options in free agency. There are options through the draft that they could look at to possibly replace Ronnie Stanley. It's definitely going to cost a lot of money to replace Ronnie Stanley, but if you want to live up to your word, if you want to have this hope for a potentially top 5 offensive line in 2025, then I think doing what you can to lock Ronnie Stanley down for at least another year, maybe 2 years, keeping him away from whatever market he has in free agency, that's going to be the best strategy. And selfishly, it works to my advantage great, because if they can lock him up before the start of free agency, which happens to overlap with the NCAA tournament, then baby, I'm going to just be sitting on my hands watching, buzzer beaters and Cinderellas all day. And I don't have to worry too much about anything besides the small potatoes guys who, the Ravens will obviously have to take care of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just Ronnie Stanley. It's also Patrick McCary that they have to worry about along that offensive line. And I've heard so much about how well the Ravens turned over 3 guys on the offensive line last year. And look, they were still able to produce an above average or at least average level offensive line play. That's great. You don't want to do that every year. I mean, you as few guys as you can possibly turn over on the offensive line as possible, the better off you'll be. And so if you can get one of these guys back, whether it be Ronnie Stanley or Patrick McCary, you'll be a little bit better off. And I think the obvious preference has to go to Ronnie Stanley because you have Andrew Voorhees that you could use at guard. So that makes Patrick McCary not as necessary to this team. I mean, it makes a lot of sense for the player and for the team to bring him back because the Ravens know him better than anybody. There's obviously a long track record of injuries that he has undergone that will make other teams question his availability and his worth. And so you have the potential to get a Pro Bowl level left tackle for a 2 or 3 year deal potentially because of the injury concerns, because of the age. So for the Ravens to bring back Ronnie Stanley, I think would go a long way towards getting their team, at least keeping them at where they were, their roster at the same talent level going forward. All right. We're also asked. Oh, go ahead.
And two factors I think that could help the Ravens. One, I think Ronnie's first half of 2024 was definitely a step up from the back half. So, if you are looking at just pure momentum over the course of a season, and I don't know how GMs will make that kind of evaluation if they think that him tailing off a little bit in weeks 10 through 17 is an indication that maybe he doesn't have the juice to be a 17 game competent, well above average starter. That could help the Ravens. And then two, and maybe more interesting, I just don't know how many teams are in the market right now for a plug and play left tackle. I think Mina Kimes has brought this up. Just you look at the number of teams that might have an interest in a Ronnie Stanley. And obviously you can think of the Patriots, that's probably the big one. That's the team that has probably been linked to Ronnie the most. But they could also take a swing on a guy like Will Campbell with that top 5 pick and have it be much more cost effective. And maybe he's, from day one or, by year 2, he's a better player than Ronnie Stanley. And you have the cost savings of not having paid $20-25 million a year for Ronnie Stanley. Even the teams that might be interested in Ronnie Stanley, if the Ravens keep him off the market, then we'll never know exactly what kind of interest there would be in him. So I think the fact that there are a lot of potential first round draft prospects and there aren't as many left tackle needy teams as you might think could work to the Ravens' advantage. And maybe if that's something that Eric DeCosta can communicate to Ronnie Stanley's team and they see the writing on the wall themselves, then perhaps the Ravens get him for less than what he would have gotten on the open market.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a particularly deep free agent class at any position. Tackle is also not a particularly deep class, but like you said, how many suitors are there really going to be for Ronnie Stanley? I think a team that is looking to shore up tackle for their young quarterback, like the Patriots, who have a lot of cap space, I think they would want somebody that they want to be sure of is going to be on the field more often and also for longer. So Alaric Jackson is a guy that you've mentioned on this podcast before, is the Rams tackle who's going to hit free agency. He's a few years younger than Ronnie Stanley, and he may not be at his peak. He may not be as good as Ronnie Stanley was at his peak, but also you could sign him to a 5-year deal and feel like you've shored up that spot for 5 years. Whereas Ronnie Stanley, you could hand him a 2 or 3 year deal that won't necessarily answer that long-term question at tackle. And then maybe in a few years, you're looking back in the first round or in free agency. All right. Other than Ronnie Stanley, some other topics that were hit on. Eric DeCosta was also asked about the possibility of extending Derrick Henry because Derrick Henry had said during Super Bowl media week that he wants to retire a Raven. He obviously has only the 1 year left on his contract. And Eric DeCosta said he has a picture of Derrick going up on his office wall. Quote, "So what does that tell you?" Jonas, it sure seems like Eric is not only proud of his success in finding and signing Derrick Henry. I don't want to say finding because everybody knew Derrick Henry was out there, but in signing Derrick Henry, but he would also want to maybe keep this partnership going by extending the King.
Yeah, I mean, if you get an extension done, then you bring down that cap hit for 2025. Obviously, he's the 2-year deal that he signed last offseason was backloaded, and we didn't know until he started running through guys' faces again that this year would be a certainty. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, I think we talked about it last pod or a couple pods ago, just the maybe disadvantageous leverage that the Ravens, the leverage situation that they now find themselves in, where Derrick Henry is coming off a all-pro season, and he's also getting up there in age, and he's not necessarily a three-down back, but he is so central to what the Ravens did on offense, and he's a guy who, if there's anyone out there, maybe even more than Saquon, that you would trust to be someone who ages like a beautiful wine, it would be Derrick Henry. So I think it's probably safe to say that the Ravens, by the time the year kicks off in 2025, will have done a new deal for Derrick Henry. I'm just curious to see, one, how many years it would be for, and two, how close to the top of the market. If it's not at the top of the market, that deal would look like for
Yeah, I mean,
Derrick.
if it's just like a 1-year extension that just like takes him through 2026, like would Derrick Henry want that? Would he feel like I'd rather sit out this year, or, play out this year on the final year of my contract and hit free agency again and try to cash in again? If it's a 2-year extension, maybe that's a little bit more palatable, and that would take him through like his age 32 season, for example. So there has to be a delicate balance between locking this guy up and making sure that he is compensated, but also not wanting to extend your risk too much by paying him into his mid-30s. In terms of free agency in general, now, Jonas, we've talked about it a lot on this podcast, and we're going to have a full free agency preview in the coming weeks because it is just around the corner. But we've talked a lot about how the Ravens often get to this point in the offseason and they start saying, we have so many guys under contract. We're paying such big money to all the guys that we have. How can you expect us to go out there and sign outside free agents when we're paying Lamar Jackson and Marlon Humphrey and Roquan Smith and Nnamdi Madubuike, all of them, the money that we're paying them, and we're going to be paying Kyle Hamilton and Tyler Linderbaum. So we got extensions on the way. How can you expect us to go out there and find guys outside of this organization to come in? So Eric DeCosta said this week, he calls it couch cushion coins to find money to sign these free agents. He brought up the guys that they already have, under contract. I'll editorialize here and say maybe if they hadn't spent $37 million of which were guaranteed for Marcus Williams, that they wouldn't have to, they'd have a little bit more money at their disposal. And maybe if they extended Nnamdi Madubuike a year before they ended up having to pay him $98 million, maybe they'd have a little bit more money at their disposal. But Jonas, do you expect the Ravens to once again have a kind of quiet free agency and to let other teams go out there and sign the big time free agents?
Yeah, that's especially if they get the Ronnie deal done over the next 2 weeks or so. I just don't know what else you're going to do besides just work on in-house guys, maybe renegotiate guys, certainly cut guys. The Marcus Williams situation is going to resolve itself pretty soon with how they renegotiated that contract. Obviously Arthur Maulet doesn't have a huge cap hit, but based on his injury situation and just the fact that, the Ravens have some good depth at cornerback and probably will add to that group this offseason. That's the kind of guy who, even though he wouldn't give you huge savings, he would give you the kind of savings that you need to be cap compliant and maybe make a small move here or a small move there. So for all the Ravens who are interested in T. Higgins, not happening. For the Ravens fans who are interested in the Ravens trading for Jair Alexander, that would take a huge amount of heavy lifting from the Ravens front office to, restructure guys, to cut guys. Certainly the Mark Andrews situation weighs heavily on all this just because of the potential savings there if they trade or, God forbid, release him. But I think this will probably be a far, far quieter actual free agency period than last year, because last year we got Derrick Henry on like the second or third day of the after the legal tampering period opened. And I don't know that there will be anything close to that, just because, one, as you said, this is not a particularly deep free agency class that's flush with big name guys. And two, if you are trading for someone of a certain caliber, then they probably already have a pretty big contract. And I just don't know how the Ravens would would make that work with their current cap situation, which is not great, but it's certainly
Yeah, no
manageable.
matter what list you find of top free agents available this spring, Ronnie Stanley is in the top 5, and we've already just listed why there are concerns about him as a free agent. So there really aren't like too many $100 million guys that are going to be paid this spring. There just isn't that kind of level of free agents. And it just wouldn't. I expect the Ravens to still do some stuff. Last offseason, it was a lot about the questions were how many of their own guys could they retain? Because there were so many guys that were hitting free agency at once. They did a good job keeping a lot of the guys that hit free agency. Bring back Kyle Van Noy, bring back Arthur Millette, those kind of contracts, extending Nnamdi Madubuike. But this offseason, it just doesn't make sense for the Ravens to go out there and spend big time money on any one player. They don't have one glaring need either that you say that the Ravens have to. So if they go out and sign Ronnie Stanley, technically they've signed a top 5 free agent. It would just be one guy that they would be retaining. You mentioned Mark Andrews. Let's talk about him, because at the end of the season press conference, John Harbaugh, Eric DeCosta threw their full support behind Mark Andrews and said, this is a guy that, we expect to be here. This is a guy that is, one of the great players in Ravens history. Eric DeCosta was asked about Mark Andrews' future down in Indianapolis, and he mentioned how Mark Andrews will go into the Ravens Ring of Honor one day, but he said, we'll figure out all the roster machinations in the coming weeks. Now, this is particularly intriguing because the Ravens have 3 tight ends right now that are all entering their walk year: Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely, Charlie Kolar. Eric DeCosta at the end of season press conference also said, basically, we don't have to make a decision on any of these guys. We don't have to cut. We don't have to trade. We don't have to extend any of these guys right now because they're all under contract through 2025. Over the coming weeks, sounds to me, Jonas, like the Ravens are looking to make a decision on Mark Andrews and that tight end position sooner rather than later. How did you read that?
Yeah, that was, I think the more interesting part was just him, as you said, not really committing to Mark, saying that there's no bigger fan of Mark Andrews than me. He's been a blessing to have on the team, making it sound like it's almost we're in the past tense right now.
The Ring of Honor comment was
so
like, it's like he's looking ahead to Mark Andrews' eventual retirement.
Yeah, and Mark, you could argue, is still in his prime, and I know that regardless of what the Ravens do, I mean, I think if Mark for some reason agreed to a pay cut of have a $3 million salary, there would still be Ravens fans who would want him gone. It's just the whole situation is toxic because of what happened in the playoffs, because of him kind of shrinking in the moment afterwards and not talking to reporters, just his playoff record in general. I think a lot of the biggest Lamar stands out there maybe use as a crutch for Lamar's own playoff shortcomings, which we can have that as its own kind of ball of wax. But I'm sure Eric is in touch with plenty of tight end needy teams, to say nothing of the LA Chargers. They are probably the team that is most linked, along with the Denver Broncos, to all these potential first round tight ends. But why take a chance on a Tyler Warren or a Colston Loveland if you can get a Mark Andrews who's already ready made and has been a all pro level performer. So I'm sure with what Eric DeCosta said today, it was kind of like hanging a for sale sign on the Mark Andrews situation. But the guiding principle of the Ravens front office, from Ozzie to Eric, has been right player, right price. And I think it would be absolutely foolish for them to cut ways with him, because even though you are getting some salary cap relief, you're also losing a guy who could be, the leading receiver on a Super Bowl contender next year. You're losing a valued locker room leader. You're losing a trusted target for Lamar Jackson. I did kind of connect the dots, perhaps foolishly, Paul, with Eric DeCosta saying that he was planning on traveling down to Florida to see Lamar, because that could be to just catch up. That could be to talk about how he feels about certain aspects of the franchise. It could be to hear him out on a potential contract restructuring, renegotiation, extension, all that kind of thing. But it also might just be wanting his thoughts on how palatable it would be to lose a Mark Andrews, considering just that street ball connection that they've had for so long. So I still think it would be really, really silly of the Ravens to part with a guy like that unless you are getting like a top 100 pick. I just think that, you don't find guys who have double-digit touchdowns and were maybe the most efficient slot receiver in the NFL last year on trees. It's very, very tough. There's a lot of scarcity for guys like that. So it's gonna be interesting to see what happens. But obviously, if we have that ticking timeline of just a couple weeks for those roster machinations, then I guess I should probably get off my ass and start writing a couple different uh, you know s- s- structures of stories for all the various ways in which this thing could play out for
Yeah,
Mark.
I agree. I mean, we said it after the season ended. It doesn't really make sense for the Ravens to just part with one of Lamar Jackson's most trusted weapons when they are still in the midst of a Super Bowl window, and just because of the way that things ended, and not get anything in return. Now, if they were to trade him, that would make more sense, but it would have to be, like you said, Jonas, for a pretty sizable asset. I think that there would be some interest though for him around the league, whether from teams that want to get him on the last year of his deal and try to get a contract year from him, or teams that want to acquire him and extend him. I mean, I think there are a lot of teams out there that have young quarterbacks or will have young quarterbacks if they draft them this year that could benefit from getting a trusted veteran in there like Mark Andrews. I mean, look at what Zach Ertz did for Jaden Daniels and the Commanders. I mean, he kind of revived his career. He was a nice safety blanket on a team that didn't have a whole lot of weapons at a time when we thought his career was getting close to an end. So maybe there is a team, we keep mentioning the Patriots has that team, but like a team that really has a dearth of weapons and is like, all right, we're going to go out there. We're going to draft a wide receiver in the first round. We're going to draft a left tackle, but we also want to add to that tight end position. So let's just trade a future pick in order to get, somebody at that spot. So I could see something like that happening.
Yeah. And Gianna did a great story during the 2023 season on Namdi Matabike, and she was able to get Calais Campbell, and Calais had a huge impact on Namdi's development in Baltimore, and being a guy who would make sure to get the right amount of sleep, make sure to work out, just do everything he could to maximize his potential. And I think the common theme of the Calais Campbell experience in Baltimore, pretty much anywhere he's played, is that the guys that he comes in contact with are better for having been a part of his orbit, because he is just such a professional. He's such a great guy. He's such a team first personality that you have no choice but for some of that goodness to be rubbed off on you. And I think you could probably say the same thing about Mark Andrews. Like, I remember talking to guys when I think he was still on his rookie contract, where there were undrafted rookies who were stealing things about how he released at the line of scrimmage and making their own game better. And Isaiah Likely has talked over and over again about how having Mark Andrews be his teammate has been one of the best things for his own development. So at a certain point, obviously, you have to run the cost benefit analysis and decide whether having this guy, for as great of a locker room presence he is, actually measures up to what you would have to pay him when that bill comes due. But it would be inconceivable to me that the Ravens would part with this guy for pennies on the dollar, nickels on the dollar, dimes on the dollar, when they are still trying to contend for Super Bowl. And if Mark had gotten sick, let's say, before that Buffalo game, hadn't been able to play, the Ravens still lose. I just don't know. Like, would we still be having these same kind of narratives about Mark Andrews? Would we still be having these same kind of discussions and ill will toward him? Or is it just a thing where people are so hung up on what was admittedly a terrible game for him that they just want him out of their face completely? It's just, it's tough for some guys it's tough for fans, I think, to think rationally about something that they care so much about. But that's why, you pay Eric DeCosta and his front office as much money as you do, because you have to think with a sober attitude and, a well-rounded perspective for what this guy actually means to your team.
He's not a distressed asset. I mean, just because he dropped, just because he fumbled and dropped what would have been a game-tying 2-point conversion in a playoff game, he's still one of the better pass-catching tight ends in all of football. He's still a multiple-time Pro Bowler. I mean, he's still a good player, and he is still not yet 30. So he will have value around the league if you do intend to shop him. All right, Jonas, we've been already talking for an hour. Let's get another
Don't
quick
miss
word
the
from our sponsor.
2025 CIAA Men's and Women's Basketball Tournament in Baltimore, February 25th to March 1st at CFG Bank Arena. Watch HBCU teams battle to be crowned champion. Check out the free fan fest and performances at the Baltimore Convention Center. Enjoy downtown's top restaurants and stay in one of our amazing hotels. The CIAA Men's and Women's Basketball Tournament. You want to be here.
All right, Jonas, if we're going back and evaluating our performance on this podcast, I think I said the word like too often. Do you agree? Is that something that you picked up on?
No, I was hoping that we would have a window to talk early on when you brought up the word of the day, because maybe this is just the way my weird mind works. But do you ever think about just like how absurd certain aspects of the English language are? Like when you think back to, I forget, I think we've talked about this, just what foreign language you took in high school, but I took Spanish. In a lot of ways, Spanish just makes so much more sense,
Yeah.
like logistically and structurally than English does. Like the fact that you could have a a foreign language speaker come to this country, become a huge football fan, and then be told that the word that they thought that that they know means to mush things together, combine, is in the NFL context pronounced combine. That would just completely knock my socks off. And there's so many words like that where it's said it's spelled the exact same way, but in certain contexts it is pronounced in completely different ways. And I just think that we don't give enough credit to foreign language speakers who come over to America and have to deal with all the weirdness of this language we call
Oh,
English.
absolutely. Completely agree there. I do wonder also, though, what other contexts have you heard the noun combine? Because the only context I can think of is the NFL. I don't hear people
Farming, right?
a combine. Oh, I guess so. But what do they use that? What's the usage there?
I don't know. I'm not a farm boy. I grew up in a middle class background, far away from the Midwest. I guess I should probably know more about combines now that I do. My alma mater is technically part of the Big Ten conference, which is firmly Midwestern. But I just don't know.
I've got it, Jonas. Second definition, according to Merriam-Webster, a noun, is a harvesting machine that heeds, threshes, and cleans grain while moving over a field. Just wild. That is nothing whatsoever to do with a combination of people and interests. Do you think anybody's still watching this or listening? I think they're pretty bored.
And it's pronounced combine, right? Not combine harvester.
I think so. That's why they have it in Indianapolis, I guess, out in Indiana, because there are probably some actual combines in that state. All right. At Jonas_Shaffer is his handle. I'm at Paul Mancano. And at All Banner Sports, please do subscribe to the Baltimore Banner. $1 for 6 months to read all of Jonas. This is great work. Giana Han, thanks so much for joining us. Kyle Goon, his great work as well. There's so much more to be covered from the Combine in Indy. Next week, I think we are going to do on the Banner Ravens podcast a free agency bracket, because the NCAA tournament is around the corner. And we did this last year where we tried to guess who the Ravens would sign. We just missed it. We predicted, who did we have winning that tournament last year, Jonas? It was we had it down to Kyle Van Noy at the end.
Was it Tony Pollard?
No, I did predict Tony Pollard would go pretty far. He made it to like the Elite Eight. It was
what's his name?
The linebacker former Dolphins linebacker.
Oh, Van Ginkel?
Yes. We had Van Ginkel in our matchup, Andrew Van Ginkel, but he
went for a lot more money than was initially projected for. But we were on to something about him being an actually good player, because he was a beast.
So technically, we were right. So we will have our free agency bracket hoping next week. Thanks so much for tuning in. Write us a good review. Write us 5